Good morning.
Good morning. Make sure it all works today. A little bit of technical difficulties, but I think we are good. Can you hear me, Karen?
Yep, I can hear you loud and clear.
There we go. And my light keeps turn it back. All right. All right. Aside from Apple's deciding to do an update on me, I gotta open up everything. But I got it up pretty quick. The presentation is loading. Come here, we'll share it, we'll play it. Everything looking good on your end?
Looks good. Looks
Okay,
good.
let's get the iPad unlocked, ready to roll. So yesterday we left off after the end of plan quality management. So let's do the recap. Let's do the journey from there to now. So we just received an email from our Salesforce application. Was a notification. We log into our system and we see a new project there waiting for us. So okay, we take a look, and it's a new implementation for one of our customers, and we want to find some more information out about this project. So we see that it's going to be for a new customer. This isn't the type of customer that our company typically works with. This is going to be a special case, and they want us on this project because we're really good and they need white glove service. So we send an email back to the sponsor. In this case, maybe it's the CEO or the founder, and we say, okay, let's discuss this project. So he says, great. I want to get our software onto this company's system. I want to do it in, let's just say, a month, and we want to do it for less than, we'll make the numbers easy, 100 grand. And so we say, okay, what is the definition of success? And he says, well, if the clients are happy and they want to give us referrals, and there's no issues, there's no bugs, then we're good. We say, okay, what can we do? What actions can I take as a PM on my own? You know, if they ask for changes, what changes do I need to come to you for, and what changes can I do myself? You know, what can I approve or deny on my own? What type of lateral, sort of authority you're going to give me? And he gives us as much authority as he thinks we need. And we say, okay, we got the high level scope, schedule, budget of this thing, 100 grand in a month, and we know what the scope is. Do this white glove implementation service. Do we see any high level risk? And this hasn't been done in their environment. It's not something we've worked on before, so we'll have to really pay special attention to it. So we make note of that. We know what the definition of done is, what the success criteria is. He's given us our authority, or she's given us our authority. And so we go back, we write up this document. Maybe we meet with a couple more of the senior level managers and some other folks who are really good from the engineering department that, may know about this unknown environment. And from there, we come up with what we think is going to be the high level plan, and the sponsor signs it. And so we say, great, I now have a charter that gives me the 4 things that I need. I have my level of authority. I have my high level scope, schedule, budget, and risk. I know what the success criteria is. And now that the sponsor signed it, I now have authorization to start my project. So I got my 4 things. I say, okay, I'm pretty good. I feel good about the 4 things that I have here. And so we go on and we say, okay, let's go find out all the people whose interest is going to be positively or negatively impacted by this project. And so we go and we look and we see that, we got folks from internally, from departments we're going to have to use. We obviously know the client, we're in a regulated environment. So we think about those folks. We think about all the people who may be impacted by this project, whether they're going to be involved or not, whether they're participating or not. We just think about all that and we mark them down. All right. And now that we got this list, we go in and we call maybe a couple other people from we don't yet have a project management team, but we got a couple people that we met with, from the sponsor when we initially developed the charter. And some of those folks are going to, help us with some of this high level stakeholder stuff. So we call them in a room. We conduct meetings after we've gathered all of this data. And now we want to go and analyze this data, right? So we go and we perform stakeholder analysis. We use the stakeholder grid and we chart power over interest. And we note that all the people who have a high level of power and a high level of interest in that upper right-hand box, we are going to manage them closely, whether they're for the project or against the project, okay? And then we say all the people have a high level of power, but don't have that much interest, we're gonna just keep them satisfied. Again, whether they're for the project or against the project, we're gonna keep them satisfied. And then all the people who don't have much power, but they have a lot of interest in that bottom right box, we're going to keep them informed. We're going to make sure that they're on a distribution list, that, they have access to any intranet sites or portals. And then all the people who don't have much power and have no interest, well, we can't ignore them. We don't trust that. This project is too important. So we put them on the watch list because some of those people may become interested, or some of those people may become powerful and interested. So we put them on the watch list. And so we say, okay, great. A couple of these stakeholders, we need to dial in a little bit more. So this time we use the salience model and we draw 3 circles, and we have one that has power, a sense of dependency, and a sense of urgency. And we know those folks who have a lot of power and a lot of urgency are dangerous stakeholders. Those folks who have a lot of power and a lot of dependency, they're dominant stakeholders. And those folks who have a lot of dependency and a lot of urgency, they're our dependent stakeholders, right? So we have a dominant, a dangerous, and a dependent stakeholder. But then we find the one that has power, has a sense of urgency, and has a sense of need, right? Legitimacy, they need it. So we find that definitive stakeholder in the middle, and we use that to analyze some stakeholders as well. And now that we've done that, we put all this information into our stakeholder register. And we decided to call it a register because it's going to be a living, breathing document that we're going to use on an ongoing basis. We'll consult it, we'll look at it, we'll update it. This document's going to live beside us. But we also recognize that we're going to keep this sort of close to our chest, right? We can't get let this information get out to a lot of people. So very few people will see the entire document, and an even smaller amount of people will even discuss it with you. You have your small crew and you know what you're doing. So you feel great. You've got authorization, you've got your authority level, the high level scope, schedule, and budget, and you know what the success criteria is of the project, all of that in your charter. And now you have all the people whose interests are going to be positively or negatively impacted by this project, whether they're for or against. And we have strategies for that in our stakeholder register. And we have now initiated the project. And we say, okay, great. Now that we've initiated this project, let's go plan it. So we go to develop a project management plan. And at that point, we recognize that, well, we're not really going to be done developing this plan until we've developed all of the other plans. So we note that we need a change and a configuration plan. So we come up with our change management plan. We go back to the charter to see if there's any information in there as we're gathering data. We go and we look at our company's processes and their assets and what their policies are. And we determine that, the company already has sort of a formula for managing changes on the project. So we go ahead and we use that and we put that into our change management plan as to how we'll deal with changes, how we'll accept it and approve it, and what the process is. So now that we have that plan, we say, okay, but every time we make a change, how do we know about the version? How do we have version control, whether it's for the product, version 1, version 2 versus a new release, or for a document? And so we say, you know what? Sometimes we historically have problems. Let's make sure that we have a very good configuration management plan that outlines how people ought to be saving documents, what the schema should be. Are we going to go month, year, date? Are we going to go year, month, date? How are we going to do it? Is it going to be V1, V2, or VA, VB? Is it final? Is it draft? So we come up with a sort of a plan for how to identify changes within our documents, within our deliverables, within our plans. And we have a process for making change. And we say, okay, great. We have a change management plan and a configuration management plan. Let's continue on developing this project management plan because we know it's not going to be done until it's been signed off on by the sponsor, by key stakeholders, the project team, and ourselves. Now, that's not normal in project management practice, but we're doing this PMI project because we're giving them the white glove service. And so we're going to follow PMI, and we're going to remember that when we have our project management plan, it is not complete until those 4 entities have signed it: the PM, the team, key stakeholders, and the sponsor. So we say, okay, let's now figure out the scope. And we say, well, how are we going to do this? Oh, let's come up with a scope management plan. So we first go back, we go to our PMO and we say, hey, we're working on this project. It's going to be white glove. We're implementing something to a place that's never been done before. What do you have for us? And they go in and they say, well, you know what, here's a couple documents here and you're free to use these if you want. If you want some training, we got some there. And we say, great, man, it's pretty cool. We have a supportive PMO. They're not trying to control us. They're not directing us. They're just supporting us. So that's good. So we go in, we use the information they provided us, and we develop a scope management plan that says how we'll develop the scope, how we'll get it approved, how we'll make any changes to it. And then along with that, we recognize that we also need a requirements management plan, because we're going to have project requirements, but then also product requirements and solution requirements and stakeholder requirements and business requirements. And we're like, oh gosh, it's a lot of requirements. Let's make a plan so that we know how to capture them, how to trace them, how to track them, and we know what attributes we're going to use if we decide to come up with the requirements traceability matrix. And so now that we have all the how, we say, okay, great, let's go and let's do this thing. Let's develop the scope. So our next process is to then go and collect requirements. So we say, let's go to our stakeholder register and we find all the people who are going to be impacted, and let's go get their requirements. Even if we're not going to meet them, we want to get their requirements because people need to feel heard. They need to feel like they had an opportunity to give their thoughts. So we go and we collect everybody's requirements. We go to all those stakeholders. We might not go to the people who have no power, no interest because they're on the watch list, but we've gone to all the other stakeholders and we've collected their requirements, business, stakeholders, solution, project, we've collected them all and we've put them on a list called requirements documentation. And we said, all right, how are we going to manage this? How are we going to keep it together? And we looked at our scope management plan and our requirements management plan. And based on the number of requirements we had, the recommendation was that we ought to use a traceability matrix. So we take that list of requirements that we came up with, and we then put it in an Excel spreadsheet. We put all the requirements in column A. And then in column B, we put who the owner of the source is. In column C, we may have the business value. In column D, we may have test cases or test criteria for several or some percentage of those requirements already. And we keep filling out each attribute that we want to track about this requirement just becomes another column, and we keep adding columns until we're satisfied with the amount of information that we will need to ensure that we've been able to track and trace every requirement back to an owner or a source, and B, that we've captured them all. And so now that we've got all these requirements, we say, great, let's come up with the scope. So let's go to the scope. We think about the inputs that we're going to need. We go back, we look at the charter because it has high level information. We go back, we bring in the stakeholder register. We bring in the requirements list that everybody has. And now we match up the requirements to the charter. And we notice that all these requirements here match up with the charter, but all these requirements up here don't. And so now in our scope, we know what we're going to do and we know what we're not going to do. And then we go back and we look at the charter and we look at, how, what the definition of success is and all the different criteria. And we determine our development approach, how we're going to actually do this, right? We determine if we're going to build it, on site and then transfer it to the customer's environment, or if we're going to create a dev environment on the customer's infrastructure that we build there, right? We figure that all out, like how we're going to do it. And then we figure out how we're going to get sign off from the customer, right? Are they going to test it? Are we going to have somebody run through, and do sort of a click test, a user acceptance testing? How are we going to actually get someone to sign off on this scope? And we think about what the best way is, and we write that down. And so now we have this essay, this document that's rich. It's very detailed. It says what we're going to do, what we're not going to do, how we're going to do it, and how we'll get sign off. And we're like, okay, this is great. When we read this and we close our eyes, we can literally see it's almost like we're building a project. So we feel comfortable about that. And we say, okay, let's break down this work. So we then go back and we pull in the charter again, because it has high level information. We pull in the scope statement that we just created, right? We may pull in a couple other people. We think about EEFs and OPAs, how we sort of do this. And we also use our plans, our scope and our requirements management plan. And then we go and we break down the work. We go and we decompose. We decompose the scope statement into deliverables. And so we decide, should we create a work breakdown structure where we start at the top, which is white glove implementation, and then we break it down into, dev, test, QA, staging, prod, maybe even prod A, prod B, who knows, right? Do we do something like that? Do we have a work breakdown structure where the lowest level will be known as work packages, and we'll assign a numbering scheme to it known as a code of accounts? And if we have any expenditures, we can put that in a chart of accounts. Are we going to do that? Or maybe we're just going to have a backlog. Maybe we just have a backlog and it's written in the form of user stories. But either way, we decide and we break down the work and using decomposition as a tool and a technique. And then when we're done breaking it down into this visual backlog or this visual WBS, we then turn around and we create a legend, if you will, known as the WBS dictionary. And so now anybody can look at our document and our picture that has a little box, has a deliverable in it, has a number in it. Oh, what is that? And they can go to this other reference document and look at this. Oh, that number 4.6 is testing, and testing is going to be done by this group and should take approximately this long and should cost approximately this much. And so we have a WBS dictionary that describes the WBS that we have, this picture, and we have a document called the scope statement that's very rich and super detailed. And now somebody can read that, get a visual, then look at our visual to see where maybe in their head they made some stuff up that wasn't right. Now that they see it and like, oh, I totally get it. But they had a little question about one of those pieces and they're able to go to the WBS dictionary to answer it. And now that they have that document, this detailed picture and a legend that describes it, we now have a baseline. We know what this project is, what it isn't, how we're going to do it, and how we're going to get sign off when we feel really good about it. We're like, okay, this looks good. I think we can get this signed off on. Let's go and develop our schedule. So we go back and we say, how are we going to do this, team? And we call in some folks, some other PMs maybe. We bring them in who've done detailed schedules before. We bring them in as subject matter experts to use their expert judgment as a tool and a technique, right? And we then come up with a schedule management plan that says, this is how we're going to develop the schedule. And we're going to use this tool to do it. And we're going to report out on these days and times. And we're going to estimate in days, not minutes or hours, but just days. And, and we keep going and we come up with our how. And we say, okay, we feel good about this. We have a good plan for developing a schedule. Let's move forward. So now we go and we define our activities. What are all the activities we need to do in order to meet each of those deliverables in our WBS or our backlog? And so we go and we now decompose again, the same tool and the technique we use when we broke down the work. We're now going to do it when we define activities to further decompose them from nouns to verbs, from deliverables into actionable steps, which is what we're doing here. So we go and we do that and we get all these activities and we put them in a list and we get an activities list as an output. And on the way to doing that, we know which of those activities are major milestones. Like, okay. And when we make a separate list, milestone list, all right? And then we think about the attributes of those activities. What's the predecessor of this? What comes before this activity and what comes after? And we make a little note for each of the activities, the predecessors and the successors. We note, when could we start one of these sooner? And when should we probably pause back if it comes to it? And so we note the leads and lags and all those. And we say, okay, there's several other attributes that we can collect and we assign other folks on the team to do that. And when they're done, we now have an activity list, we have a milestone list, we have all the attributes for these activities that we want to track. And so we say, okay, great. Let's see how it looks. Let's put it in order. Let's build the schedule. So we think about sequencing the activities. And then we go to put all the activities in order. So now that we have the leads and lags, we have the predecessors and the successors, we start thinking about, okay, how do these activities relate to each other? And so we note the relationships. We note that some activities can start when the other activities start. But we note that some can't start until the other activity is finished. And then we know that some activities can finish when the other activities finish, but some activities cannot finish until their activities start. And we note that, wow, the activities that cannot finish until the other ones start, that's really rare. That start to finish, that's not normal, but okay, we have a few of those. And then we see the finish to start. Activity A must finish in order for activity B to start. And we say, okay, yeah, that's the most common one. We see that all littered through. And so as we put together and we sequence all of our activities out, we start to think about the dependencies as well. And we're like, oh, well, this activity has a mandatory dependency on this one. We can't start it. We can't do anything until this one's done. There's nothing we can do it. It's just, we can't install this OS until we have the bare metal machine. All right. And so we think about all those mandatory dependencies. We think about even the legally or the contractually required ones that may be external, but since it's contractually required, now it's a mandatory dependency. So we think about those. Then we think about the discretionary dependencies. Which ones can we just do when we want? Which ones, if we needed to fast track the project, should we do? And which ones, if we wanted to do them out of order, would be fine. And so we think about that. And we think about which dependencies are internal and external, which dependencies, like, we don't really have to do this. It doesn't really govern the project per se, but it's government regulations. And if we want to sell it, or if we want to not be sanctioned or fined, then we got to do that. So we think about those external ones. And then we think about the internal ones. Like, what does our company need? What do they require us to do? Maybe we have an internal auditing system that we need to pass first in order to get to the next piece. The project doesn't really need it, but the company does that as a fail-safe. And that's our internal dependencies. And so we think about the mandatory, the discretionary, the internal and external dependencies. We pair that up with all the relationships, some form of finish and start. And we say, okay, great. We've now sequenced out our activities and we have a network schedule diagram. We feel good about that. We're like, all right, most people use Gantt charts. Most people use bar charts, but we got a network schedule diagram because this is a white glove service and we only have a month to do. And we got to make sure that we don't miss anything. So we say, let's estimate the durations. So we go on and we think about, activities like this are similar to activities that we've done in the past. And it's pretty safe to say that it's going to be the same. So we can analogously estimate there. And then we see some activities, knowing that analogous isn't that accurate, but knowing that, for this one, it's okay. We see some and we're like, we need a little more accuracy. And so we use some statistical, historical measure. We say, well, normally engineers can complete or QA engineers can do, 40 test cycles in a day, and they want 100 test cycles. So it's going to take 5 days. So we parametrically estimate. And then sometimes we're like, you know what? This is white glove service. We need to make sure that we know everything, and we're going to bottom up estimate everything. We're going to estimate every little piece to make sure that we don't miss anything. We know that's expensive. We know it's going to take the longest time, but we know it's the most accurate. And so we're going to use that one. All right. And then at other times we don't know. So we got to take a simple average or a triangular distribution, meaning we're going to take 3 numbers and divide by 3. And then sometimes you're like, I need a confidence interval. I can't just take an average. I need to know if I'm going to be 68.26, 1 standard deviation, 95.46, 2 standard deviations, or 99.73, 3 standard deviations. We need to know that. And so we might use beta or PERT, right? Instead of taking a simple average, we're going to place more of the weight on the most likely. We're going to multiply that number times 4, add it with the pessimistic and optimistic, and divide by 6. And then we're going to take our pessimistic minus our optimistic divided by 6. And that's where we find the standard deviation. We'll plus minus that EAD or that EAC, estimated activity duration or estimated activity cost. We'll take those EACs plus minus 1, 2, or 3 standard deviations to give us a 68.26, 95.46, or 99.73 level of confidence. And we're like, okay, so for some of those, we'll estimate that way. So now that we've used all the estimating techniques that we have in our bag of tricks, we then think about, which of these have a little bit of risk? And so we think about reserve analysis, and we're like, okay, and we go back to our teammates and we said, hey, you're not buffering this time. You're not padding your times, are you? You're not adding any extra things that aren't needed. And they say, no. But then one person, you look in their eyes and like, okay, I did. And so we get them to clean those up. And then we go back and we do reserve analysis. We go back and we have clean data. And then we go say, okay, I'm going to put a percentage, of the time, or I'm going to do a set number of time, days, periods, whatever it may be. But we do reserve analysis. In some sense, we might even run Monte Carlo. You might even run Monte Carlo to say, okay, in order to install in this environment, how many, what's the likely case? And so we'll run tens of thousands of simulations to see what it might look like. And we'll use that data as well. In other scenarios, we might think about the what if, but we're like, all right, I think we've got it. We've got our activity estimates and we feel good. Let's now develop the schedule. Let's now do a forward and a backwards pass, and let's find the critical path. And so we go back to that network schedule diagram, and we take our estimated activity durations, and we now do network schedule analysis. We're going to analyze this thing. We're going to double check, measure twice, cut once, because we can't get this wrong. So we're going to do a forward pass. And we start with all the activities we can start on day one, and we put them in the first column. And then we do activity plus duration. And that gives you my early start and my early finish. And then when we go to the next column, we look and we see, okay, which activity is dependent on the past activity? And we look back and we see this one has only one predecessor. And so we take the end date and we place it there. But then we see this other activity has 3 predecessors. And so we look at the 3 predecessors. We find the one with the biggest number because this activity cannot start until all 3 are done. So we have to wait until the longest one finishes, and we use that number. And then we do early start plus duration equals early finish. And we continue that all the way till we get to the end, doing that forward pass, making sure that we always take the bigger number when we do the forward pass, and then we get to the last activity. And then we say, okay, we're going to finish right at a month. So we set that early finish equal to the late finish, or I should say we set the late finish equal to the early finish 1 month, and we start to work backwards. We take late finish minus duration equals late start. And we do that, and we do the backwards pass. And then when we do the backwards pass, we look back to the next column and we say, okay, this activity precedes only 1, so we use that number. But another activity precedes 2. And so in this case, we take the smaller number and we use that as the late finish. And then we do late finish minus duration equals late start. We do that for the column, and we rinse and repeat. We get to the next one. We see how many predecessor activities. We find the one with the lowest number, and we choose that. And we go all the way until we get to the end. And then we subtract the late start from the early start, or the late finish from the early finish, and we find the float. We find the float of each activity. And we go through and we note that the float of each activity tells us that this is the amount of time that this activity can be delayed without delaying the entire project. So we think about that and we're like, okay, great. We know what that float is. And we think about the total float that's shared along a path. We pick one path and we find the activity with the highest float value, and that becomes a total float for that path. And so we say, okay, we know how long each path can be delayed without delaying the project. We know how long each activity can be delayed without delaying the project. And then we look for those activities that have 0 float. Then we find a chain as we go through. And one of the chains, right, we have like 15, 16 chains of activities. And we find one of those chains. And we note that in other projects, we've had 3 or 4 chains that had 0 float, because you can have multiple critical paths. But on this one project, we only have one path that has 0 float. And we're like, okay, that is our critical path. And we note that the critical path is the longest chain of activities, right, that you can complete the project in the least amount of time with 0 float. Okay. So we recognize that, and we're like, this is our critical path. We got to make sure that we manage tightly to this, put our best people on it. We got to make sure that these activities have a lot of risk reserves built in, that we make sure everything is going to go right, because if we get a delay of 1 day on any of these activities in the critical path, our project is going to get delayed. But all the other ones have a little bit of float, so we're okay. So we're like, okay, we feel good about our schedule. And when we're done with it, we have this real detailed project schedule. And it shows when when work is happening on the project, on what days and times of the year. And so we know we're working every day this month. And we pair that up with a resource calendar, different, that shows when particular resources are available. And so then that lets us know about if our schedule is tight or not. We also figure out, we may need to have a schedule baseline, because we can't send this detailed schedule out to everybody. And then we also think about, what if we have overruns? And what do we need to do with resources? So we think about resource optimization techniques. And as we look at our schedule, matching it up with the resource calendar, we recognize that there are times where this resource, we need a resource for maybe 10, 12 hours, but that resource is only available for 8 hours, and it's a cap. So we said, you know what, we're going to level this resource. But we're sensitive to the fact that leveling may push out the schedule. It does not care about that hard deadline. So for other activities, we say, oh, we can't push the schedule out. We're going to have to smooth these ones out. And so we look for any discretionary activities that we might be able to do a little bit earlier to smooth out the peaks and valleys. But because we care about the hard deadline, if we're not able to do it, we're not able to do it. We're just going to have to run overtime or have rolling shifts or something like that. And so then we think about, well, how can we compress the schedule? What if the schedule gets out of hand? And we say, okay, well, we can crash the schedule if we need be. We can go back to the sponsor, to our founder, our CEO, and we can say, hey, we're down. We need more bodies. We need to throw more resources at it. we don't want to add any risk. We know it's going to increase costs, but we'll keep our risk down. We'll be able to achieve this project. Or we think about opportunities to fast track. And we're like, oh, we don't have a tight budget. We don't have more money, but we can do these activities. And it's going to be pretty risky because we're now doing them in parallel, but we accept that risk, right? And so we think about those times where we can optimize the resources, when we can compress the schedule. And then now that we've totally looked at that, we feel comfortable with our schedule, and we create a schedule baseline. We create sort of a high level modified version of the schedule that can be approved by management, by the customer. We keep our project schedule separate. We have all that data that we've collected from the standard deviations, from the different estimate types, from all the things that we've done. We might even run Monte Carlo and what if scenario analysis again. All that becomes schedule data. And we're like, okay, great. We have what we need. We may have had some change requests. We may update our plans to change our approach in order to meet the schedule. We may update some documents. And we say, okay, great. We now have a schedule management plan. We feel good. So we move on to developing the cost. We go back to developing a cost management plan where we come up with the how we're going to estimate, how we'll capture all these things. And then we go and we estimate. We do all the same estimating techniques that we did when we captured the schedule. We analogously and parametrically bottom up or 3-point estimate, whether it's simple or beta/PERT. And we use those same estimating techniques, and we come up with estimated activity cost, all right? And we don't forget about reserve analysis so that we can put contingency reserves aside now in dollar amounts for these activities. Then we go back and we say, okay, great. We've done all this. We took our inputs. We used tools and techniques. We created an output of activity estimates. Let's go and determine a budget. So we go back, we pull in the charter again as an input. We use our plans as an input. We bring the scope baseline in. We bring these estimated activity costs in. We think about any contracts that we may have already executed or what we may do in the future for materials and supplies. And we aggregate everything up. All right, we roll it all up. We add it together, and we do reserve analysis again. We do a little more risk because there's risk in an entire work package versus just individual activities. So we do that again, and we roll it all up, and it becomes our cost baseline. And we recognize that this money contains contingency reserves, and we own it. Now, we don't know how much management reserves are going to be kicked in for the unknown unknowns, but for the known unknowns, the things that we know that we don't know, we can account for that with risk, and we've done it, and we put it in. But the other stuff we don't know, so we recognize that we don't own the project budget. Management owns that because it contains management reserves. We own the cost baseline because it contains contingency reserves. And so we feel good about our numbers. We've looked at it. We've looked at funding limit reconciliation to make sure that we're going to get the right money at the right time. And we're done with this process. And we're like, all right, we've got 3 baselines. We're feeling pretty good. We've got 3 baselines that we're going to be able to use to get signed off on for our project management plan. It's going to be the what of our project. So we continue on and we say, okay, let's now estimate resources. Let's now go and plan quality. Let's make sure that when we build this thing, that all of the requirements will be met with consistency, right? And we recognize that we're not talking about grade here, right? We're not talking about different categories that we'll assign, and it's sort of subjective, hand stitched leather versus synthetic leather. We're just talking about meeting the requirements with consistency. There is some type of leather on this steering wheel. In this case, we're not building steering wheels. We are implementing software. So we think about all the things that we need to do, that we have to do in order to test it. So we develop our metrics. We think about the different metrics that we might want to choose in order to keep the quality high. We think about our test scenarios, and we think about the cost of quality. And we say, okay, quality comes into 2 categories: the cost of conformance and the cost of non-conformance. We think about that and say, how do we make our products conform? And we think about, we can prevent errors, and then we can appraise our product to make sure it doesn't have errors. So we think about that and we say, okay, how do we prevent the errors? Let's train everybody. Let's put the documents out. Let's document, let's put all the processes out. Let's document the processes, get them on the wall so that everybody can see it. Let's give them a manual. Let's give them the best tools too. Let's use all the best stuff that we can to build this. We're not using any of the cheap stuff. We're not skimping on money here. We're giving these people the white glove service. And then ultimately, we only have a month, but we're going to make sure that everybody has enough time to do it correctly. We're not going to rush you, right? If we give you time to do it right, if we give you the best tools, if we train you up, and then if we document the processes for your reference, that should prevent all the errors. And we think about the cost of that. And we're very happy to pay that cost because it's going to be lower than, the cost of non-conformance. And so we say, okay, this is all preventative costs. Well, we got to test our product too. And so we think about testing, maybe destructive testing. We try to overload it. We do stress test. So what happens? Can we break this system, right? Can we cause a bug? What can we do? Right. And so we think about all that, testing, destructive testing, and inspecting. And we think about the cost for that. And we say, okay, we now know the cost of conformance, preventative cost, appraisal cost. And so we say, well, what happens in the cost of non-conformance? And we think about it and we're like, well, there's really only two categories. If it fails internally while we still have it, or if it fails externally, it's in our customer's hands. And we say, well, if it fails internally, hey, we can rework it or scrap it. Right? We're not going to redo it or fix it. We're just going to rework it, and we're not going to throw it away or put it in the garbage. We're going to scrap it, but we can do those two things. But if it gets into our customers' hands, well, then we're going to have warranty work. We're going to have to pay money in order to fix this, or we're going to have liabilities. People are going to sue us because the product's not working. They're not collecting the right amount of money. They're getting sanctioned by their local governments for, not for whatever it may be. And so now they're going to hold us liable. Or we may have lost business. No one's going to buy from us anymore. Our reputation is going to be bad. That's the worst thing. So we think about the cost of quality, preventative, appraisal, internal and external failure cost. And we're like, that's the cost of conformance, the cost of non-conformance. We feel good about it. We have our metrics. We have a test case and a test plan. And we develop a quality management plan that we can utilize to ensure that as we build this product, we know how we are going to make sure that these requirements meet these deliverables meet its requirements with consistency. And so now we go on and we're getting ready to estimate the resources that we're going to need in order to achieve the quality, to meet the budget, to meet the schedule, to adhere to the scope that we see in our charter. And that's where we are at today.
Awesome.
Does that help?
Yeah. Thanks for tying everything together.
That is the story. All right. So now, how big do you think your project would need to be in order for you to have to do all of that? Everything that I mentioned. Do you like in your world now, how much of that is overkill in that story that I've told?
I would say like 60% of that is overkill because a lot of the processes we have are like repeatable.
So remember, that's how this exam is. You are building a rocket ship. You're building software for the next rocket ship that's going to go. And that's what you're getting ready to go implement, which is why you're going to have to do all 49 of these processes. But for your project, since it is overkill, what is the term that PMI says you ought to use to determine which of these processes you should pick and how deeply you should, how detailed you need to be with each process?
Tailoring,
good. And I don't think we talked about this term, progressive elaboration. Progressive elaboration is the term that PMI uses to say this is how we develop our project management plan. As we iterate and more information comes in, we get granular, we get into the weeds. Okay, so make a note of that term. That's going to be on the exam. Progressive elaboration. That's how we iterate. Okay, do you see the slide?
Yep.
All right. So here we go, 10:12. I went a little over, maybe 4 or 5 minutes on that. So we are now into plan. Oh, no, not really. You know why? When I normally do this on day one, we stop right before develop schedule because we start the day. So you got a little extra. So actually that we're good.
Okay.
All right. So now what we want to do is we want to come up with a plan that we can use so that we can figure out the resources that we need, how we're going to get them, how are you going to estimate like which ones we know, right? So we're going to come up with that in plan resource management, and then we're going to estimate the numbers and types of resources, right? Not just people, but in this case, materials, machines, and supplies. I just want to make a note here that in version 5432, I don't know about version 1, that estimate activity resources used to fall in the schedule. It used to define activities, sequence activities, estimate activity resources, because you got to know who you're going to use before you can estimate the durations, then develop the schedule. So that's how PMI had it all the way up until version 6. In version 6, they pulled it out of the schedule, pulled it into resource management, and now we see estimate activity resources here. So by the way, when we're in planning, we're doing all of this. So although we're going through this chronologically and we're just now getting here, technically speaking, in order to have developed a true schedule or a true budget that was accurate and complete, we would have needed to already have estimated the activity resources.
Got it.
All right, so now we want to look at the different approaches or methods. I need to get this screen out the way. There we go. All right, we want to define the approach that we're going to use in order to manage resources, meaning what's our approach for getting people? Are we just going to go to the different managers and request? Are we going to send out formal documentation? Will we just go to our sponsor and ask them to spearhead this and do it for us? And then what if we need outside labor? Are we going to go to a staffing agency? Will we hire these people? Will we just pay the staffing agency? Like, what are we going to do? How will we get materials, machine supply? So it's a how, and it's all about physical and human resources as we see there on the bottom. And then you think about your project's aspects. What would these be called? When you think about your environment, the location, cultural issues, internal politics, what are these?
EES.
Perfect. So we think about those as we're making our plan. And now we say, okay, we want to create a plan, but we also need a team charter because we're going to onboard people, and we need to make sure that everybody has a good understanding of how to act on a team. What's our social norms? So we're going to develop a team charter as well, and then we may update some documents. So we're going to look at these inputs, and then we're going to use these tools and techniques on them. So the resource management plan is what we want to get so that we can figure out how we're going to categorize the different resources and allocate them in certain aspects. How do we manage them? How do we release them? So it is a subsidiary plan, right? And you've got to make sure that, you have these different aspects that tell you what's happening. For instance, a release plan, right? There's a release plan, and in the release plan, it's like, how do we offboard people? You may use some trick that I've learned here. I'll pay this forward. And when we hire third-party resources, we tie the last payment to some sort of lessons learned. So when you leave this project, before you get paid, your final deliverable is to either sit in a session with us or write up a document, that will give you with some questions so that we can capture your lessons learned before you go, right? Or, vice versa, before we onboard someone, whether they're internal or external to the project, one of the things that we do is we give them the scope statement, and then we ask them 3 questions that you could only answer if you read the scope statement. I don't care how many people would tell you about the project. These 3 things are buried in there, and we want you to read the scope statement because we want you to know how your slice of the slice fits in the entire pie, right? And so these are just things that you can do to, and it gets people to understand a little bit better, therefore they'll do their job better. These are little tips and tricks that you can implement into your practice, but it's also a part of the plan and part of the exam as well. So physical resources and for the team, and we need guidance for both. So we're coming up with a how to do this. So we also think about a team charter. All right, the team charter that says, do you guys do team charters at your organization?
It's just like a diagram where people fall under who we report to, and
So
like a org chart.
Okay. So what I'm talking about is, okay, how long do your projects typically last?
1 month, 2 months.
So I just came up with a good number. I was just doing that. All right. And so, how often do you work with the same people?
Externally or internally?
Internally, like with the teams when you're doing implementations.
We have like every other day stand-ups.
Okay. But I mean, so when you do an implementation, is your team the same people that you're going to work with regardless of the client? Or is it that every new project or every new client you're going to have, there may be 10 people and you're always going to work with 3 out of those 10. You just don't know which 3. Is it like that? Or
Oh yeah.
you work with the same people for every implementation?
Yeah, I think I work with the same people for every implementation.
Okay.
Or,
So
and actually, the first one, it's like a group of people, but you don't know who you're going to need to work with in engineering to fix something.
right. Okay.
Yeah.
So in that sense, then here's where the team charter comes into play for you. It's not necessarily the org chart, but it's something like, okay, for this particular project, this client likes X. So as a team, we are going to do Y and Z, meaning if I email you, I expect a response within 24 hours. If I text you, I expect a response within an hour. If I call you and leave a voicemail, I expect your immediate response, like that at your next available. Something like that. Like what are our norms? If you have a problem with my work, like if my work is dependent on yours, and so I'm waiting for you to do something, and you're taking too long, how should I approach you? How are we going to talk to each other? As we're developing the strategy for completing this project and how we're going to attack things, and we're brainstorming, how do we respect each other's ideas? How do we make sure that we have an environment where nobody's gonna say, "Oh, that's dumb," or "I wouldn't do that"? And how do I make sure that doesn't happen? So that way, while 2 people may say that to each other and they're both A-type personalities and they're fine, it doesn't turn off the other B-type personality, and then they're kind of like, "Oh man, I don't even want to say anything because I don't want anybody to call me stupid," right? How do we create that? So that's what this team charter really is. And for you, you might be able to create one that you think should be the best for your team, regardless of who you work with, and then either tweak it slightly or you keep it in every new team you work with. You guys discuss it and you say, this is our team charter. This is our sort of norms. So that's what this really is. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, that does make sense. Is it kind of like does it include service level agreements and stuff like that? Or it's more of like how the team should be interacting with each other?
The latter. It's about how the team
Okay.
should be entered. Yeah. So this is really an opportunity for you guys to make your own rules. Like this is the rules of engagement for us as a team. All right. So that's what it is. It doesn't really matter about the service level because everybody has to adhere to that regardless, right? If your company creates that. So this is just how we're going to work together.
Got it.
All right. So we take the charter, the scope baseline. What's the scope baseline again?
The scope statement, WBS and WBS dictionary.
Good. The quality management plan and any project documents, right? We take those into account. Charter has high level. Nowhere else is it high level. Everything else is detailed. So anytime you see the word high level on the exam, you can just stop reading. You can go straight to the A, B, C, or D and pick the charter or the initiating process group. And if there's both of them are in A, B, C, and D, then you might have to go read to figure out which one they're talking about. But literally, high level is left up for the charter, the initiating process group. All right, we'll take the scope baseline and any documents. Think about EES and OPAs, right? Not much here, right? EEFs, you understand those. OPAs, we think about what we can use to not reinvent the wheel. And then we represent this data. And so what you mentioned earlier, you sort of have an org chart. And these don't have to be top down. They can go sideways, although that's not as beautiful, right? But it certainly can be done, just so you know if you see that. And then assignment matrix. This is a responsibility assignment matrix, right? And usually the type of responsibility assignment matrix that PMI is going to test you on is the RACI chart, right? So who's responsible, who's accountable, who do you consult, who do you inform? And then here, this might either be names of team members or it might be roles for team members. And then you can put a little checkbox like this team member might be responsible for this. This team member might be accountable, right? So on and so forth. Do you guys use RACI charts?
I have.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So you understand that. And then, this is just a text format or you want to get a little deeper. So that's it on the plan. Now we're going to go and actually estimate the resources. So now we have the plan. We're now going to we're now going to think about, well, these resources are going to cost us money. And so we need to think about all the people and the physical resources that we're going to need. All right. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we'll use these. We'll use these resources to estimate the cost. I know here the resources requirements defined and estimate costs will also be used to define here. In the practical application of things, you usually define your resources first so that you can then go and estimate your cost second. So just for the exam, we're going in order.
Okay.
So here's our Itto table. We're trying to get the requirements, basis of estimates that comes up again, and a resource breakdown structure. Now we saw work breakdown structure. We're now going to see a resource breakdown structure, and later today we will see a risk breakdown structure. Okay, so breakdown structures, PMI likes these. Pictures tell 1,000 words. So breakdowns and registers. Put this up here. Okay. And same estimating techniques, right? Nothing special from here. The only thing here is now alternatives analysis. Like what different could we do versus just estimating? So we want to get the required resources. This is the output that we're looking to get. What resources do we need? What type, what quantity, how much, right? What they need, any assumptions. We need to get a basis of estimates. Why do we choose this one? Why do we think we need this engineer? Why do we think we need outside resources, right? We got to come up with a basis for that. Like, why did we choose this? Okay. And then we like resource breakdown structure. So, note that it's not names. We're not looking for names. We're just saying in the project, we need personnel. Here's the roles. We may write out the names of the roles, but we're not really looking to even put people in here. We're just looking for roles. That way that we know that people can fill the role. So it's easier to do it in this fashion than it is to put names on. So we go by the project, the need, and then the sources for those needs. That makes sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. We use project documents. We got to take the activity list because what needs to be done is going to determine the resource that needs to do it. So we'll take that. We also take the assumption log into account because if, we're assuming that we have the right talent available, or we're assuming that we can just go out and get it. So we take those logs into account as well. In addition to the cost estimates. If you happen to estimate your cost prior to estimating your resource, now you got to go take that cost into account to make sure that you find a resource that's within that range. And that's common as well, by the way. It's very common to estimate your cost first and then go and do your resources. So I know I'm telling you in a practical application, we typically estimate the resources first and then the cost, but it is also common that the cost already there, you're bound by that, and now you got to go find resources to fit. Mm-hmm. All right, now we take into account EEFs and OPAs, specifically resource locations and availability. All right, the best engineer for this job might be overseas and might be in a completely different time zone than the rest of the folks overseas. And so now we got to think about how that's going to, structure our project in terms of time and meetings and stuff like that. When we think about OPAs, what are the policies regarding, staffing? Can we just go get that engineer, or do we have to request them? Does it need to be formal? Can I just call up the manager, or do I have to put something in Salesforce? All right, so we think about that. And now for tools and techniques, same estimating techniques. Hey, this activity is like that's like last activity, therefore we can use the same type of resource, right? Or we needed one person to do, one person can do 40 hours, in a week, and we need to get this done in a month, and we have 400 hours. Therefore, we do the math, we're going to need 50 people, something like that. All right. So, and then bottom up estimating. All right. Every little resource, we think about that. So again, you see the least to the most accurate in order, the quickest to the longest, the cheapest to the most expensive. All right. 3-point estimating, by the way, does not come up as accurate or inaccurate because either it's an average or you're using confidence intervals. So just note that 3-point estimating isn't necessarily accurate or inaccurate, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
All right, now throughout the estimating process, you got to give options. You got to have options so that you can figure out, what is going to work best given the constraints on your project. So you think about skill level. Are they full-time or part-time? Are they contract versus company? And that might determine like the sensitive information that they might be working with, and everything else there, tools and the make or buy decisions. This is sort of the idea that, right, because we're analyzing data in here, this make or buy decision is typically an output. I just want to say that for the exam. You usually have make or buy analysis as a tool or technique, and then make or buy decisions. Now, we're analyzing data. So in this case, this would have been an input from one of the project documents that we took. And then we would analyze that to say, should we still buy this from a third party or should we do it in-house? So typically in tool and techniques, you see make or buy analysis, which is should we do it or not? And then the output of that process is a make or buy decision. But in this sense, when we're estimating and we're analyzing the data, then that decision is something that we would analyze. Okay, any questions on estimating resources?
Can you go back to the part where you said that the analogous estimation wouldn't be inaccurate, like when we look at it the same way as we did for like estimating activity duration?
Sure.
Yeah.
First, that's and excuse me, that statement is for the practical application. For
Oh,
PMI, analogous is always going to be the least accurate, parametric, slightly more accurate, but still inaccurate, and then bottom up estimating the most accurate, right?
mhm.
But in the practical application of project management, when we are analogously estimating resources, that's not typically inaccurate. It's not inaccurate for us to say, well, we needed a carpenter to hang the cabinets when we were building the condos in Kansas. So we're going to need a carpenter to hang the cabinets when we're building the condos in San Francisco, right? It's still pretty accurate when you're just talking about the resource type.
Okay,
But
yes.
when you're estimating time or money, that's where it can get really inaccurate when you're analogously estimating.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right, so now communications management. So here we want to identify and document the appropriate approach to communicating project information to each team member and stakeholder, right? I can't say that any better, like word for word, that's literally what we're doing here as we come up with the plan. We want to identify and document the approach. How do we need to approach each team member? Some team members they're very visual. Some team members are auditory. Some team members are kinesthetic, right? So we have to think about that. And then we have all the stakeholders as well. Now, team members are stakeholders, but they're internal. So there's a little bit difference there versus externally communicating. So we do differentiate there. But for the most part, when the exam asks you questions about stakeholders, you're a stakeholder, team members are stakeholders as well. All right, so just in the context of communication, we break them out. All right, so we're focused on creating the ideal approach. Remember that these plans, there are guides. They tell us how to proceed. They outline our approach. Those are the key terms that you'll see on the exam. Like when you're getting questions on the exam, it will literally say, which of the following documents will act as your guide? Which of the following documents will outline your approach? Which of the following documents would you look in to determine how to proceed? The how is a dead giveaway, right? So proceed, approach, guide, all management plans. That's what we're doing here.
Mhm.
All right. So I'm going to come up with these strategies here. And we want to think about this early on in the project so that we can review it and make tweaks and make sure that everybody's getting what they need at the right place, the right time, right? So I'm going to come up with a management plan. And in order to do that, we got to use these tools and techniques. We got to think about technology and models, methods, our team skills, and we'll use these inputs in order to create that output. All right. So in order to create the plan, we got to use those tools and techniques, but the plan is going to tell us how we'll structure communications, how we'll communicate, and how we'll monitor it. Like, how will we know if people are reading our emails? Maybe when we send out our emails, we'll do the same thing that we do for our customers. We'll put the little pixel in there and we can see that you've opened our email. All right. Do you guys do that?
Yeah.
Yeah. See, all right.
Yeah,
It's
we
very,
have
very
some
common.
software.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm not asking you for a read receipt because I deny all read receipts. All right. You do not get to know when I opened your email. All right. And if you're a person like me that's worked in enterprise security, I also turn off HTML. So even if you send me an email, you're not going to know that I opened it. That's a little hint, by the way. Nobody does that because then when you open your emails, they won't have any pictures. But if you don't want the systems to track you, you can literally just turn off HTML in your email, and then the ones that you want to see the pictures, you can hit the button. But I digressed. So this plan is a subsidiary plan, and it's going to tell us. It's really going to say how do we make sure that the right stakeholders get the right information in the right format with the right level of granularity and the proper cadence, right? That's what we're trying to do here. Okay, so here's sort of a generic piece that you can see for communications management plan, right? Who are we sending it to, and who is sending it, and what's the method, right? So let's talk about, I think when we get to tools and techniques, we will talk about that. Yeah, we'll talk about the methods there. So, we're here, right? So we're going to look at the methods, the formats, the frequency, the times, and an escalation process. By the way, when PMI ask you about that, they will ask you a question about you are a project manager for XYZ company, and one of your vendors you are having an issue with. You're having an issue with one of your vendors. So you decide to escalate the issue. No, I'm going to change this. You're a project manager for XYZ company. You're working on this white glove implementation project, and one of your team members is having an issue on the project. You're not sure whether or not you want to remove this team member fully or reassign them. And so you need to now go escalate. Which of the following documents would you look in to determine how to proceed? A, resource management plan. B, stakeholder management plan. C, communications management plan. D, project management plan.
C.
Okay, good. And why? Why do you want to use the communication management plan and not the resource management plan?
Because you want to identify the method of how to communicate with the individual.
Very close. Very close. Because in an escalation plan, it is going to tell me the method, but it's going to tell me whom should I communicate with next, right? So if it's an internal team member, do I go to that team member's supervisor? Do I go to my project director? Maybe I communicate with that person individually because I had that authority that's been granted to me within the charter. So your communication management plan will have the escalation policy. And the reason why I asked that question now, I want you to be familiar with it, is because PMI will try to trick you, meaning they'll talk all about human resources, and this, and that, and then say, so you got to escalate. Where should you go to? And because they've been talking about human resources the whole time, they're going to put human resource management plan as A right there. So that way, you'll pick it. So just remember, whom do I communicate with next? If I'm escalating, it's communication. Right. Now, we also need the stakeholder register because different stakeholders have different communication requirements, right? Remember, we got to keep stakeholders engaged. So if I know that this stakeholder isn't going to read emails, then I might text them a link, right? And say, hey, here's your link. And they're going to be like, oh, what? And they're going to click the link, at least, because people are just curious. And if they know who you are and you send them a link, they're going to click it and then they'll see it. And at least they'll, right? But if you send them an email, they're not going to read it, right? Or I'll send them an email, say, here's a document you requested. And like, well, what document did I request? And then they'll open it, right? So, or some people, I can just put it in the body of the email because I know they're going to read it, right? So that's why we take the stakeholder register into account, because we got to see, what's the stakeholder's interest level and how can they influence? How much power do they have? And therefore, I got to make sure that I communicate this type of information to them versus the folks who have no power, but they're very interested. I got to communicate something different. Right. So that's the idea there. Now, as far as other inputs, EEFs makes perfect sense because a lot of it, if you're distributed across the globe, okay, then it's going to have to be virtual. And then if it's virtual, well, are we going to use Zoom? Are we going to use WebEx? Are we going to use Skype? What are we doing there? And same thing with OPAs. Are there, rules for how we need to do this? Is there a database that we ought to be capturing lessons learned from how we communicate with people? So we take those into account as well. And now we look at the tools and techniques, right? We have the methods, the models, the skills, right? So we got to think about all that. So technology is the vehicle that drives your message from its source to its destination. Just remember that. That's what technology does for us. So 100 years ago, in 1920, I would imagine that, I think there were cars back then. Yeah, there were cars. I'm like having a history fart in my mind right now, but it's sort of like the technology then would have been like the wheel, because it started out like maybe 100 years prior that they're delivering on a horse and buggy. Oh, my speaker's gonna die here. And then they delivered on a horse with just like the little sack, and then the wheel came out, and they're like, oh, now the horse can pull a barrel, pull this big cart full of mail. It can fit way more mail, right? Then we got the telegraph. Oh, I can just send you sort of like almost an instant message, right? I can just, send you a telegraph. Then the telephone, right? Then pagers. Remember pagers, 43770? Okay, so you had a pager, so pager code. Okay, all right. So we had that.
I never did, but
oh, okay, but do you know 43770?
Yeah.
Okay.
With a calculator.
Okay. And so I'm telling my age here with my beard here. So but that's the idea of technology, right? So now we can email people. We can email you in the body, we can email you attachment, or maybe the OP at our company says we have to email you a document so that you can go log in, so that we can control, like we can see who's actually looking at this document or not, right? We can have access control for that. All right, so technology is simply the vehicle that drives your message to its destination. Sometimes that destination is there, and it's the vehicle for people to come and pull that information from. Right. So that's how we think about technology. And then the methods allow you to send information to people. So I want you to remember it like this. You have an interactive form of communication. I can push out a message, or I can put it somewhere for people to pull, right? Push, pull, interactive, right? Let's talk about these forms. So interactive communication, somewhere make a note that you use this form because you want immediate feedback. I need your immediate feedback. All right, the exam's going to ask you about that, so make a note. And interactive, just the only way I can interactively communicate with you, I must call you. If I can't get you on the horn, then video message you. And if I can't do that, then face-to-face. And if I can't do that, then instant messaging, and not text messaging. If it's text messaging, it would have to be something like iChat, right? Because do you have an iPhone?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you know how like if someone else has an iPhone, you can tell if if they're responding to your message in the moment. Like you can see if they all right. That's like instant messaging. So in that form, it's interactive because we are communicating back and forth, right? So that, or if it's like instant message on your screen, like that's interactive, but texting somebody is not. Texting somebody is just a push message. I've pushed you a message, right? I called you on the phone to have an interactive conversation with you, but I couldn't get you, so I left you a voicemail. Therefore, I've pushed you a voicemail, right? So push communication just means that you sent to specific recipients, whether individually, on a distribution list, as an alias, whatever it may be, right? Pull communication says that you put it somewhere and the people got to go get it. You put it up on the intranet site. You put it up on a Salesforce portal. You put it up somewhere where people have to go log in, look at the information, get it for themselves, SharePoint, something like that. All right. So let's do a little quiz on this to make sure we know. I am advertising, and I put a billboard up over the Bay Bridge for everybody leaving the city, coming back to the East Bay. I put it up there, and only the people who are driving on the East Bay can see. Push, pull, or interactive.
Push.
Why push?
Because the message was put out there and you don't necessarily know how it was received.
Okay.
Oops. But it also, I think it's pull actually.
Why?
Because it's a large audience, and if someone wants to look at it, it's there for them to access.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to give you a hint here. In order for a message to be a push message, it needs to be sent to a specific recipient or recipients.
Ooh,
Regardless
yeah.
of the size of the party, just needs to be sent to specific people.
Okay, so, then I'm gonna go with pull.
Okay. So, which is right. So I say, okay, man, people aren't pulling down my message. They're not looking at it and reading on the Bay Bridge. So I'm going to advertise on the radio. And you know what? I'm going to advertise on satellite radio. And you know what? I'm going to get specific. I'm going to advertise only on Howard Stern's show, only for the people who are purchasing XM Sirius radio and have purchased his particular pack. Those people, right? Because they're going to listen to a show. So I'm going to advertise on the radio. So that way that message is going to come through on their speakers. Mm-hmm. Push or pull?
That's push.
Why?
Because it's very specific about who you're sending it to.
Okay, so who did I send it to?
The radio show's listeners.
Okay.
From a
so now imagine that you have oh, I see where you went there. Okay, remember, let me say this. Remember that if it doesn't say it in the question, it does not exist. Meaning, while I went and said, yeah, I'm specifically advertising only to Sirius XM and people who have purchased Howard Stern's show, but I didn't say that anywhere on there that those people had a distribution list going to, like, you know what I mean? I didn't say that part. So don't make that up in your head. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So if I advertise on Howard Stern's show, what if at the moment I'm advertising, you're sitting in your car, you're driving, you're listening, and then your husband sneezed. He sneezed like a couple times, like sometimes we go, choo, 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 right? And so then you miss my message. See, I'm going to give you another one. Now I say, you know what? I'm going to advertise on the Super Bowl. I'm going to advertise on the Super Bowl. I'm going to be the first commercial because I know people like to watch the Super Bowl commercials. So I'm going to advertise on there, and hopefully everybody that's watching will watch. Push or pull?
Pull.
Pull. Good. Why pull?
Because it's a large audience.
Get away from that.
Okay.
Get away from the large audience. Because what is it? Because it's not. It's pull because I'm not doing something. What am I not doing?
You're not specifying
exactly
the message, like specifying to whom the message should
needs to get to. Yeah, I'm just advertising, right? Certainly you might have went to the bathroom at the time that first commercial came in. Oh, commercial, got to go to the bathroom. Certainly you might be the person that's like, I'm not even going to start the game until the second half, and I have a DVR, and I'm going to watch the game, and I'm going to fast forward through all the commercials, right? If I'm advertising, I am not sending it to anybody specifically. I'm just putting out there in hopes that I can reach a whole lot of people, right? When you think about Facebook with reach and impressions, right? I'm just trying to reach a whole lot of people. I'm putting it out there. I don't know who's going to actually get this. All right. So that's I'm just putting a message out there for people to pull. You must go and watch that show to get my message. If you didn't watch the Super Bowl that day, it's not getting to you. Therefore, I didn't push anything to anybody.
Mhm.
Okay, do a couple more. So imagine you're now driving and Amber Alert, big red, billboard, Amber Alert, flashing all in your face, white van, whatever the license plate number is, push or pull.
Push.
Why?
Because it's a text message or it's a message sent to your specific device.
Okay. You did it again, Karen. I didn't go there. So that's my next. Usually that's how I end it. You're killing my little thing here, right? It's like I'm leading you down a path. And so the billboard's pull, but the phone is push. So usually I go with the example, hey, what about the billboard flashing all in your face? And then it's like, well, no, it didn't. Yeah, it's pull because I could be driving and I missed it, or I could be driving and I looked away at that moment, or I could be driving and I just ignored it, right? It didn't get sent to me. But if the message comes to your phone, now that's a push because I specifically sent it to you. See, I don't even have to know who you are. Let's say, here's another way. I'm going to just give you some. If I decide I want to advertise and I want to put something in the mail, those little mailers you get, like the coupons and stuff that half the time we just put them right in the recycling. That's a push message. That means that I went and I got a distribution list of homes in the area and I said, put my ad in there so it directly goes to these people. Okay, push message. Let's say I'm a hacker and I'm trying to spoof you and I'm trying to send you a fake email that looks like it's from within your company, and I'm trying to get you to click a button. I've pushed a message to you. Even if I don't know who you are, even if I just got this list of random email addresses and I sent them, I still have pushed message to specific recipients. So that's the only difference between push and pull. Did it get to someone specific or did it not? So if I'm on TV, if I'm on the radio, if I'm doing all that stuff, I'm not sending it to anybody specific, right? Now, if I'm on CCTV broadcasting to my employees at this moment, and there's been a meeting and everybody's supposed to stop work and they're supposed to be watching me on the CCTV, now I'm pushing a message, right? Because it's like everybody's watching and listening. If I'm giving a speech and I'm standing out, I'm pushing a message because it's not interactive and it's not pull. I'm pushing a message to those people. Now, I could be pushing a message to those people while simultaneously I'm being recorded and broadcast on the air for people to go and pull the message if they choose to go and watch that station. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. So if I'm advertising on the radio, even for Howard Stern's people, that's still pull because you have to decide to listen to the station at the time that I'm advertising, and you have to decide to listen to my advertisement. Right. But if I send you a voicemail with my advertisement, or I send you a voicemail in like a LinkedIn message or something like that, now that's push. Right. So push has to be sent to a specific recipient, even if it's millions of people. Right. So audience size does not matter, has to be sent to a specific person. If not, it's a pull. So when you're taking an exam and you look at these questions, just ask yourself, does anywhere in the text, does it say that I am sending a message specifically to a person or a group of people? If it does not, then it must be pull. Interactive is going to be very straightforward because I'm going to be talking with someone, and I'm going to be getting their immediate feedback. All right. So usually the questions are designed to trick you between push and pull because you can't really trick you on interactive communication. Those questions are typically, they describe it and then ask what it is. All right. So that's how you'll see those on the exam.
Okay. Was Amber Alert push?
You tell me. The billboard. If it's on a billboard, what would it be?
Oh, the Amber Alert on the billboard. Okay. That is pull.
And the Amber Alert to your phone?
Is push.
Good.
Okay. And then for pull, it's like the recipient of the message, it's more like it's likely that they'll like pull the message at their own time. Like if it's like a website or something. Well, while push, you can't really control when you receive that message.
Exactly. In fact, another term that we use for pull is self-service. Right? So self-service. So I can push you an email with a link that you can then go and pull the information at your discretion. Okay. So anytime the message that I push to you with the link, that's a push message. But then the information that you're going to go get on that website or that intranet site, that's pull.
Got it.
Right. So that's just the idea, is like, it's either you sent it to a specific person or you didn't.
Mhm.
Okay. So here's the communication model. You don't need to memorize this. This does not come up on the exam anymore. They're not showing you this picture and then asking you to decipher the picture. But it is good to know that the basic sender and receiver model. Note that, like, as you think about what you want to say and you encode it, you transmit it. And here's our communication. Because if we're not face to face, here's our technology. Because if we're not face to face, then I need a cell phone or a telephone or a video or a text message or something in order to send you this message. So either we're interactive or I'm pushing you a message. You get this message, you understand it, you acknowledge the message either by opening the email, either by, responding to my text message, either by answering the phone. And then there's some noise on the other end. And the noise is usually like, the noise on both ends could be, as you're talking to me, I'm hungry, or I'm sleepy, or I'm irritable, or I'm angry, right? So that's what the noise is. And then it comes back. So that's the basic one here. And then you have some medium. This medium could be a television, could be a telephone, could be paper, right? And so that's sort of the idea of this this model. Now, while it ensures that the message is received, it's really important to understand it does not ensure that the message is understood. Just because I've pushed you an email doesn't mean that you've read it and understood it.
Mhm.
And by the way, just because I pushed you a message doesn't mean that you get it as well. I can certainly push you a text message and you can delete it. I can push you a bunch of emails, right? We could be past friends and now you hate my guts and I'm trying to, say sorry and I'm calling you and you're sending me the voicemail and then you don't even listen. You just delete the voicemails, right? But it doesn't matter. I've still pushed you a message. Whether you
Mhm.
listen to it or read it has no bearing on it. It got to you. So keep that in mind as well.
Mhm.
All right. And the interactive here, we just see it sort of going back and forth, right? It's happening at the same time. Now the styles, they're like the styles and the cultural awareness. These are tools and techniques. So PMI is not going to test you on the different communication styles. They're just going to say that communication style is a tool or a technique. Just the same way being politically aware at your organization is a tool and a technique. And understanding the culture at your organization is a tool and a technique. All right. Or I should say, understanding culture at organizations and understanding being politically aware at organizations or within an environment is a tool and a technique. Specifically understanding it isn't, but just knowing that you need to be aware and being aware of it, that's a tool and a technique.
I see.
Now, here's the communication channel. This also is, you should know this. This is sort of like n times n minus 1 divided by 2. So there's two of us, 2 times, and then 2 minus 1 is 1. So 2 times 1 is 2, divided by 2 is 1. There is only one communication channel with me and you. Now, if we add a third person, we'd get 3 times 3 minus 1. So we'd get 3 times 2 is 6, divided by 2 is 3. There's 3 communication channels because I can talk to you, I can talk to the other person can talk to you. There goes 3 channels. Right. So as you keep going on, like if you had 9 people, then you'd have 9 times 8, because 9 times 9 minus 1, which is 72, divided by 2 is 36. If you have 9 people, then there's 36 communication channels. Right. One person can talk to 8, the other person can talk to 7, the other person can talk to 6, 5, so on and so forth. And that gives you your number of communication channels. All right. So the reason why, by the way, I believe as of July, they took this out of the exam. Like they're not testing on this formula, or at least we're not seeing it as often. Still be aware of it. And the idea was that the higher the number of communication channels, the more that the messages can be misconstrued, the more tight your communication plan needs to be to make sure that the right information gets to the right person. Because if you remember the game where we had the cup and you whisper a little something and the next person hears it, by the time it gets to you, it's like completely off. Right. So,
Right.
That's the idea there. All right, first case study.
Okay.
All right, so by posting updates at regular scheduled intervals on the hub that's accessible to all, the team is using which method of communication?
C.
Okay, the plan to send focus emails to all key stakeholders when urgency and relevancy demanded is an example of what method of communication?
B.
And the plan to use one-on-one meetings strategically is an example of what method of communication?
A.
All right, let's see how we did. Good. Push, pull, interactive's got to be to a specific recipient. So you got that one there. Now let's get on to risk management. This is my favorite process group, or knowledge area, excuse me. It's the risk knowledge area. So We're going to figure out how to conduct risk management activities. That's what we want to do when we get the plan. Like, how do we identify them? How are we going to, like, what data sources and what methods will we use? And, how will we track them? And, what's our method? So we want to get a risk management plan to figure out how to do this. And then we want to methodically go through, identify the risk, qualify them, quantify them, and then come up with a response. So just take a look. Plan risk management. So we're going to focus on defining how risk will be identified and managed to increase the chance of the project being successful. All right, risk planning should start early and be revisited throughout the project's life cycle. And that's true. All right, you start up front, but then as you go through the project, you should continually, evaluate and monitor and see if new risks are popping up. And identify and analyze them and put them into the risk register. So you have individual risk that we see at the bottom, right? It's an uncertain event or condition. And then you have the overall risk. All right. Is it just too much risk, right? There's individual activities. It's sort of like, okay, you get in your car. There's risk. There's, hate to be gloomy, but there's risk. There could be an explosion when you start the car. There's risk that when you put your seatbelt on, it might not, strap up all the way. There's risk that, the accelerator could get stuck, right? But then there's just the inherent risk of driving a car, that someone else could drive into you, or, a tree could fall in your way, or just, something crazy. Things that don't rarely happen, but the risk still is there. All right. So you got individual risk, an uncertain event or condition, and you got the total or overall risk. All right. So we want to get a risk management plan. So we want to analyze all the data that we're going to get, which are going to be these inputs: the charter, the plan, the documents, EFs, and OPAs. So what we're looking for is, how will we identify risk? How will we categorize them? How will we analyze them? How will we plan for them? And how will we mitigate or exploit opportunities? So we'll think about the methodology. That's our approach. That's what this guide, this management plan will give us. We think about roles and responsibilities. Oh, we're going to see this coming up pretty soon. I mentioned to you earlier about a risk owner. So we're going to see that coming up, right? Risk funding protocols. That's not a common thing. A lot of companies don't really have protocols for risk. But if you do work at a company, usually construction companies and places like that like they sort of have to have contingencies, you'll see what those protocols are. The categories that we want to use, right? It's sort of like weather. Weather is not a risk, but it's a category of risk. So we'll think about those categories. And then we use a probability and impact matrix. We want to define that now. So when we develop our risk management plan, we come up with a probability and impact matrix at that point. So that way it's objective, because if we go find the risk first, then do the probability and impact matrix, it's going to be biased. It's going to be like heavily influenced by us finding a bunch of catastrophic risk, or heavily influenced by us finding not very much risk at all. All right. So you just develop it first before you look for anything. That way you stay objective. Mm-hmm. And then we also think about, the risk appetite for the particular stakeholder. So if it's an internal project, well, then we got to think about our company as the customer. And if it's external, then the customer's appetite is what we take into account. So for here, we want to take the charter. High-level risk should have been identified from the get-go. Well, we're installing this on an environment that we've never installed before. That there already is a risk, right? We want to look at all of our different subsidiary plans, because how we're approaching scope, time, cost, quality, resources, all of that, even communication and procurement and stakeholders, how we approach all those will determine how risky we're going to be. Just think about this. If in your communication plan, we say we're only going to email people, we're not going to talk to anybody. No phone calls are needed for this. That could be a huge risk, because people need understanding. Sometimes they need to have a phone call, right? So how we develop all of our plans and our approach will determine like the level of risk that we're going to be exposed to. And then our documents are going to show us where their risk is as well. Stakeholders are the biggest risks to our projects. It's not the stuff that we identify. It's when people do things in a moment of passion, or being irrational, a moment of emotion. It's usually those are the things that are catastrophic to our project. So we think about those with stakeholders because we're like, yeah, if this person gets upset, they may go and do something and it could really, hurt the project. So we think about that as well.
Mhm.
And you may have OPAs that determine, which, like if there's a risk register template or a risk breakdown structure template, like we may have those. So tools and techniques, expert judgment, right? You go in and this is where you might go bring in a bunch of other PMs and say, all right, in your experience and in your expertise, what have you seen and how have you dealt with it? All right, you may do that. You may go to people who have had systems implemented for them. Okay, in your experience, what has gone wrong? What did you not like about the surface? You may ask all of those things, and from there, you'll be able to understand what their risk appetite is and, the approach that you ought to be taking. So that's it for the plan, right? There's not much for the plan. Nothing specific to the project is ever in the plan. It's just how we're going to go about doing things. But the risk specifically will not sit in a risk management plan the same way the budget and cost estimates will not sit in a cost management plan. All right. The management plans are just the house.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're going to identify risk. It's the first step in figuring out what the approach is that you're going to take, because you got to go and identify all this stuff. So we're looking to uncover all of the risks that we can find. And this is iterative. There's many different ways to do this. I mean, I've done the piece where I've had categories up on the wall and I give everybody stickies and then they go and they write it in and then they go put their stuff in the categories and then we go look at it, right? There's many different ways to do it, but we want to go and look at all of the different areas that risk could sit. All right, so we want to look at the impact, the probability, we get our risk exposure and our approach to mitigate it. Those will all come later, what we're seeing here, but we cannot do any of that if we don't identify the risk. And so the risk register is what we get as an output from this process. Living, breathing document, right? Lessons learned, stakeholder register, and now a risk register. So look at all these inputs. Why are there so many inputs?
Because you need to look at each of the plans to expose what potential risks are.
Right. Risks that our approaches are no longer valid. Risks that what we've uncovered isn't detailed enough. Risks that our estimates are no longer valid, or that what we learned in the past is no longer applicable today. Stakeholders' biggest risk, as I mentioned, risk that there's language in the contracts that are not favorable to our position on the project. Risk that our RFPs or RFQs, RFIs aren't written well enough, right? Risk that there's some government laws or regulations that are unfavorable, or that maybe our company policies and procedures that are good for the normal operations are actually a hindrance to this particular project. So we take a look at all this stuff and we'll use tools and techniques on them. We'll gather data from all of this. We'll then go analyze the data from all of this. We'll meet with people and use prompt lists so that we can analyze the data that we've gathered, and we'll use our interpersonal and team skills to facilitate the whole thing so that we can create a register and a report. Let's talk about those. So the risk register gives you all the details on every project risk. That's why it's a register. It's a living, breathing document. It's going to grow. We're first going to identify all the risk here. Then we'll qualify them and we'll get a probability times the impact. Then we'll quantify them and get the impact in either days or dollars or added scope. And then we'll come up with the risk responses and we'll keep adding columns along the way. Okay, so this is the risk register. Oh, what happened? Now the risk report is where you look at the risk register and you summarize it and you say, okay, based on, our risk register, we have 35 individual risks that have been identified, of which 3 or 4 could potentially be catastrophic. Another, and one of those has a very high probability chance of happening. Therefore, we need to mitigate that. It's not acceptable. And overall, we have a risk exposure of about 12% or equivalent of $12,000 for this $100,000 project. And most of the threats are coming from the fact that we don't know the environment, that we're going to be installing on. But there are opportunities in the sense that we will learn a new, product or service that we may be able to build and offer to other consumers or customers. And, here's the metrics and trends that we ought to be looking for. right? That's what the risk report will sort of show. It'll summarize the risk register that you can see that's very detailed, that somebody might look at and make their head spin. It's a nice little document that management can take and help to make decisions as to, you know what, Karen, you're right. I need to put aside 12K for you just in case. Okay, so that's what the report does. Now for the inputs, we also take the plans, analyze those for risk. We got to look at our what's. All right, we figure out, you know, is the success criteria there? Do we have all the milestones? Do we have enough money? We'll look at different documents. We'll look at any contracts. And then again, if there's any you know, government agencies that we got to be aware of, or yikes, any government agencies we got to be aware of, or, you know, any benchmarking results that we either met, did not meet, or exceeded. All right, and then some OPAs, we'll take those into account as well. And now the tools and techniques we use is we gather the data, we analyze it, and we use prompt lists to help with the analyzation. So the prompt list, that's what I mentioned earlier. There's like, this is one, we call it PESTO. All right. What are all the political? What are all the environment? What are all the safety? What are all the technical risk? What are all the legal risks? And the last E is, I said the environment already. I'm drawing a blank, but PESTEL is one. There's VUCA, if you've heard of that. Volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. So sometimes we'll just make those categories and we'll say what are all the stuff that's really volatile or uncertain or very complex or ambiguous, right? So there's these different prompt lists that you can use that's going to help you to figure out, you know, where the risks are. Make sense?
Mm-hmm. Is this in the PMBOK, the PESTEL list?
PESTO, VUCA, no, these are just ones I'm giving you. They don't identify specific prompt lists. Remember, they're not prescriptive. They're just going to say use a prompt list, but they're not going to give you something, right? They're not going to tell you how to do it, right? They're going to tell you why it's important or where it's applicable or who to use it with. They're just going to say this is what you need. All right, let's now qualify these risks. So now we've identified all of the risk in our documents, our plans, and our contracts, and the environment, and our processes. We've looked at all of it, right? And we've documented them down. Now we want to start looking at the probability of occurrence and its impact on the project or the organization if it does happen, right? And so we want to look for those risks that have a high probability of impact and high probability of occurrence and a high impact. And then we want to make sure that we go ahead and we focus on those risks first. All right. So remember that all of these risk ratings are subjective, by the way, right? There's no, they're all subjective. It's just based on the perception of the risk and not numerical data, meaning you and your team are going to go and qualify these risks, but they're being qualified from your own heads, right? There's no specific objective way to do this other than how you perceive, you know, risk. Are you risk averse? Or are you risk seeking? All right, so now we see here the ITTOs here, right? We're going to talk about a few of these. The risk data quality assessment is an important one. Touch on that. All right, we'll look at the probability and impact statement. These are the two that you're going to see on the exam the most. So the risk register has the probabilities and the impacts of those risks. And you have the, you know, whoever the risk owner might be. Here's the first time where we see the PM is not responsible. Okay. PM is not responsible, right? Risk owners are responsible for implementing risk responses and not the PM. Oh, fingers, I got to stop doing that. Okay. The other output is your risk report. We talked about that, and the assumption log. So while we already had a risk register, this output is really a project document update. All right. That's how we'll see this. We're updating the register because we've already created it in the last output. And then we're also updating the risk report. So both of these are project documents that we'll be updating, right? And then the issue and the assumption log, we may have some new issues, some new assumptions. So again, we'll update those. All right, key inputs. We got to take the risk register. Obviously, we got to take EEFs. We got to take OPAs. Got to take those into account. And then we'll do some data analysis. So we're going to take a look at the probability and impact matrix next. All right. And then we'll do a risk data quality assessment. But let me break this one down, because this is you'll get 2 or 3 questions on the exam that are going to describe some scenario that, you're working for XYZ company. You are getting ready to implement your software into this company's environment. However, some law changed and it changed in the middle of your implementation. Worse yet, it changed after 80% of the implementation had taken place. And so because you're not finished, you weren't able to get grandfathered in, and now you got to go back and make a change. Well, how could you not have caught? How did you not catch that? Because you likely didn't do a risk data quality assessment. So risk, the chance that one or more objectives could be positively or negatively impacted. Data, the raw information that you have. Quality, meeting its requirements with consistency. Assessment, the life cycle approach. So the question is, the risk data quality assessment is really saying, okay, for this particular event that could happen, that could have an impact on one or more of project objectives, whether positive or negative, the information that we have on it, will it meet the project requirements with consistency throughout the entire life cycle of the project? That's a risk data quality assessment. So you're going to see questions on the exam. They're going to talk about the fact that you missed something, and it's usually going to, give you a hint, because it's going to be a long project, year long, 2 years long, and some laws are going to change. And which of the following did you likely do a poor job of performing? And it's going to be risk data quality assessment, because you didn't think about the life cycle of the project and the data of that risk meeting its requirements with consistency throughout. Okay, so that's risk data quality assessment. That's, you're definitely going to see that on the exam. So remember that one. Okay. Now let's look at our probability and impact matrix. Okay. Now, by the way, you can use any probability and impact matrix you want. There is no prescriptive one from PMI. You do not have to have numbers. In fact, these could just be, for the probability, instead of very high, it could say catastrophic. You could say very likely, likely, unlikely, very unlikely. And then, or I should say this, very unlikely, unlikely, likely, very likely, and probable, right? And then here for very low, little to no impact, small impact, impactful, very impactful, catastrophic. And then these can just be colors: red, orange, yellow. And then something that's very probable but little impact would go there, right? So you don't even need to have numbers per se, okay? But this one does. So it's what we're going to use. And I want you to make notes somewhere, okay? So these risks here that score pretty low on the probability and impact matrix, these risks here, these risks is what we call passive acceptance, or we put them on a watch list. Okay. 2 ways that PMI will call it. They'll say we passively accept, or we put it on the watch list. What's the probability that someone's going to be late at some point in the project? Very high. What's the impact? Very low. Okay, we'll put it on the watch list. We passively accept that somebody might be late. Not a big deal. We'll put it on a watch list. If it becomes an issue, then we'll do more later on. Okay, so that's what you get there. Okay, so now these risks in this sort of middle shade of gray, right? These ones here. These risks are what we call active acceptance, or we put aside contingency reserves. So if you remember earlier, I said active acceptance means that we are putting away money. Okay. So if we actively accept that, what's the probability that one part of the application, or no, what's the probability that testing may take longer than we thought? It's likely. Okay. And if it does happen, what would that do to the project that we missed testing? Oh, it would be pretty impactful. Oh, okay, it's right here. All right, let's put aside some money so that way, if testing becomes backlogged, we can go and we can bring in additional resources, either internally or externally, to help us complete testing. Okay, so you got passive acceptance, watch list. You got active acceptance, put aside money, contingency reserves. That's what this means, right? You're going to put money aside for it. And then you have these risks here that score the highest, right? In this darkest shade of gray, these risks here are unacceptable risks, and we mitigate these risks. We mitigate. Okay. So three types of responses. And by the way, I'm only talking about threats at the moment. I'm not talking about opportunities. So for threats that score very low on a probability impact matrix, we passively accept, we put them on a watch list. For threats that score in the middle, we actively accept, we put aside contingency reserves. And for those threats that score really high and are really impactful, they are unacceptable. We must mitigate. We must take some action or do some activity to minimize the probability of occurrence and or the impact. All right, so that's what mitigation does. You have to take some action or activity in order to reduce the probability and or the impact. So those are the three ways. Now, for opportunities, because by the way, PMI is going to call it risk. But most of the time when we think of risk, we think of something negative. We think of the threats. We don't call them threats. We just say that's a risk. Well, there's positive risk as well, and there are opportunities. We just don't call them risk. We call them opportunities. We tend to call threats risk, and we tend to call opportunities opportunities. But risk is positive and negative. They're both threats and opportunities. For instance, fracking, I believe, is an opportunity, meaning the use of fracking now for natural gas was not its original intent, but they figured that out. The most famous one is Viagra. The formula for Viagra was not originally intended for that. It was a vasodilator. It's meant to increase blood flow so that you could get more nutrients to you. Oh, opportunity. It does this as well. Let's market that and sell it to all the people who need it. All right. Another opportunity is, let's say someone's, you know, I'm going to save this one. I'm going to save this one because we're going to get there. Actually, I'll give you more examples when we get to the strategies for risk responses. However, for opportunities, we do the same thing. All right. Opportunities that score low, we passively accept. We put them on the watch list. For opportunities that score in the middle, we actively accept. We put money aside to go, explore it at a future date or a later date. And for opportunities that score really high, we want to exploit those opportunities. So that's the other term for these here. We exploit. Other than that, the terms are the same. All right. So we want to actively or passively accept opportunities, meaning put aside money to research or just put it on a watch list, or we want to exploit the opportunities. We want to passively or actively accept the threats, meaning put them on a watch list or put aside money, or we want to mitigate the threats. All right. So exploit opportunities, mitigate threats, actively accept with money, passively accept on a watch list. Fair enough?
Are you talking about the opportunities right now?
A little bit of both, but
okay.
But yeah, opportunities we exploit. So I'm just basically saying the difference is We exploit very, high probable and highly impactful opportunities. We mitigate highly probable and highly impactful threats. So
Got
those
it.
two terms change. Other than that, we will actively accept both opportunities and threats and put aside contingency reserves, and we'll passively accept both, threats and opportunities and put them on a watch list.
Got it.
Okay. Now let's quantitatively analyze the risk. Let's put a dollar aside. So we just did probability times impact. Now we're going to do it again, but this time the impact, instead of being a percentage or a color, is going to be in terms of added days, like time, or it's going to be added scope. And if you add scope to a project, or if you add time to a project, it's going to cost you money. So the exam's only going to focus on added money. However, you can have, you can quantify risk in those three ways. You can quantify by added cost, added time, or added scope. Scope and time will cost you money. So PMI is going to focus on the money. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to look at the risk exposure, meaning this amount of stuff could happen. And if it does happen, this is how much money it would cost you. That's your exposure. Like, if you met with a personal, a financial, person that was helping you with your money and putting aside money for the kids and this and that, and they would tell you like the level of exposure you had based on your, the properties you own or your positions in the market, 401k, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same thing here. How much exposure do we have? All right. So we want to think about this so that we can come up with a response. And that's what we see here at the bottom, right? The recommended responses, will come in and will be used as inputs in planned risk responses. So as we come up with how much money this is going to cost us, it will impact how we respond. So all we're really doing here is updating project documents, in this case, the risk report and the risk register, right? But they're just project documents. So, we just get project document updates. We are going to gather data from this, and then we're going to use our interpersonal and team skills to facilitate the meeting of these folks so that we can use their expert judgment and analyze all of this information. And then we can represent it on some sort of chart or graph. So what we're doing here is we're coming up with the risk report so that we can summarize all of the risk exposure and come up with, a probability of occurrence. A probability of occurrence times impact is going to equal the quantitative analysis in this portion. Right? We can then prioritize these risks based on the ones that will cost us the most money, and then we can come up with the risk responses for those as well. So we want to look at overall project risk exposure, and we'll put that in a report, and we're reflected by the chances of project success. Like, are we likely to still be able to even achieve this given all this risk? Like, we want to be able to say that. And then we want to say the range of the possible outcomes. Like, well, if we have just the small risk, we'll likely do this. If we have no risk, we'll do that. But this will happen if all of these risks take place, right? So we need to be able to say that. And then we want to have a detailed probabilistic analysis. What are the drivers? Well, again, we don't know the environment, and neither does the client. And so we have to go in there and sort of help them, right? And then the amount of contingency reserves, right, for the desired level of confidence. Well, we're pretty confident that that Tony has seen it all. He's going to be able to go in there, and within an hour, he'll be able to figure it out. So we're just going to put aside two hours just in case we're off, and we'll go from there. All right, so we want to be able to have detailed probabilistic analysis. What is driving the risk? And we'll prioritize it, and we'll recommend responses. Those are the key outputs. All in the form of a project document update, because we're literally just updating the risk report. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So now we got to take the plan and the documents, of course, right? It's going to define our approach to this thing. So we take all the plans that are necessary, including the 3 baselines, because those are the what. We'll take our risk register and risk report, any assumptions, estimates, all of that's going to help us sort of determine the quantitative cost of this risk. Right. So it is deeper than qualitative risk analysis, because I wouldn't, it requiring robust data and more resources. I mean, yes, this is true, but, you know, in a practical application, it's really just more data and more resources. You can, you know, you don't have to necessarily say robust, right? You just need more information. You need more people to help you.
Mhm.
Right. So here's a simulation model. What is this again?
S-curve.
Good. Right. And so one of the ways that we commonly use to determine about these risks is we use Monte Carlo, and we want to run tens of thousands of simulations to see what would likely happen if these risks happen. And so we use these softwares to run tens of thousands of times, right? And then the output is a little graph that shows us like along the way, here's your exposure as you spend money and expected value of the risk, right? And in your project, your target, what you expect to spend, but because of the risk, what you're likely to spend, and if something really bad happens, you know, what happens there. So that's what we see here along the continuum, right? And it's the most common probability distribution that we see. Okay. We also can conduct a sensitivity analysis, and a sensitivity analysis will determine which particular risk have the greatest impact on a particular objective. That objective being time, money, or scope. So I should say a constraint. Which of the following risks has the greatest impact on a particular constraint? So yeah, we have this example in here, manufacturing. They may fail the install test, all of this stuff, right? Is stuff that we can look at, but let me give you a different example that I think will help. Think about if you hire somebody, right? Now, if we think about the amount of time that it takes to hire somebody, conducting interviews, we can lose a lot of time. We can, well, and that time costs money. So right now I'm talking about cost, right? If I were to switch just to hiring people and I said, now my objective is cost, you know, to hire somebody, it takes a lot of time because it costs money for us to, you know, to sort of advertise. We have to write up the description, pay money to advertise. We got to interview people. We probably have to pay for some software to screen out the resumes. Then we got to pay our internal employees to interview. And then the second round of interview, and then a third round of interview, right? All that costs money. And then they, you know, if they're the right person, then we have to, you know, do a background check. That costs money. And then we have to train them. So we got to pay money to somebody else to train this new person who we're also going to pay for just learning. And then we got to pay the IT department to process their assets and get it all ready. And then 2 days later, the person quits and they don't even give back their IT equipment. It could cost you a lot of money, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of time, well, time might not be that sensitive because the sort of the cadence to do this, to put a rec out there, to interview people, to hire somebody, to onboard them, that timing is usually similar regardless of the person. And therefore we can build that in and account for it. So it's not that sensitive, right? You know, the risk of hiring someone is not that sensitive to time. On the negative side, because if we don't choose them, then we just call the second person and say, hey, you know, you made it. Would you like to still come in? Right? We don't have to tell them that they weren't for the first pick, but we call them up. And it, on the other hand, you can see where it could be sensitive to time, because and that's where I put this model here, because if you hire the wrong person, well, they could drive down team morale and they could take a lot longer to do the work, right? But on the flip side, they could be the one person that really galvanizes the team and really, you know, we always talk about that cliche term of synergy. It's sort of like you have 3 people on a team, you add this 4th person, and all of a sudden the team is doing the work of 5 people. So, you know, that's what a sensitivity analysis does. It shows how a particular risk is sensitive to a constraint being time, money, or scope. Now, the decision tree is a tool and a technique to estimate the cost of risk, right? It's how we do expected monetary value. And that's what we see here, EVM, expected monetary value. Okay, so what we're trying to do here is we're trying to say, we have scenario A and scenario B. All right. Scenario A will have strategy 1 and 2. Scenario B will have strategy 1 and 2, and then you'll have some numbers. So let's tell the story here. So I'm building a new PMP training classroom, and I'm thinking about, should I build a brand new one or should I simply upgrade my existing facility? And so I'm not sure. The one thing I do know that if I build a new PMP classroom, it's going to cost me 120 million. It'll only cost me 50 million if I simply upgrade my existing facility. So I go to my chief marketing officer and I say, Shelly, what would happen if I build a new facility, a new PMP training classroom? Like, what would that look like in terms of demand? And she says, okay, well, give me a week. Let me run the numbers. So she comes back a week later and she says, okay, well, here's what the team found. They found that if you build a new PMP center, then you have a 60% chance of having strong demand from consumers, and that represents $200 million for the organization. There's a 40% chance that you will have weak demand because it's something new and they're not used to change. And so then that only represents $90 million for the organization. You say, okay, great. And you say, well, what if we simply upgrade? And she says, why didn't you tell me this the week before? We could have did that time, but okay, give me the numbers. Let me run them. I'll come back to you. So she comes back another week later and she says, okay, CJ, we did another analysis and it turns out that you have the same percentages. You have a 60% chance of having strong demand if you upgrade your facility, which represents 120 million for the organization. And there's a 40% chance that people still won't like the change and you'll have weak demand, which represents 60. And you're like, oh man, I have 120, I have 290, and I have 120 and 60. This don't look good, but let's do the math. So we get 80 million. Why do we only have 80 million? Because it costs us 120 million up front. So after we pay back that 200, we get 200 million, we pay back this 120, we're left with 80. And here it costs us 120 to do. We only made 90. So after we pay back the 90, we're still 30 in the hole. Now, if I add the 80 plus a negative 30, I'm left with 50 million. All right. So I would have $50 million. All right. And then we look at the percentages. And when you do the percentages, it goes down to 36 million, because if I do 60% of 80 million, I get 48 million. And if I do 40% of negative 30 million, I get negative 12. And if I do 48 plus negative 12, that will be 48 minus 12 million. I have an expected monetary value of 36 million if I build a new plant. So I said, okay, let's run the numbers here. So 120 million, it cost me 50. When I subtract out my cost, I'm left with 70. Okay. 60 million cost me 50 here. When I subtract out my cost, I'm left with 10. If I do 60% of 70, that leaves me with 42 million. If I do 40% of 10, that leaves me with 4 million. And then 42 plus 4 gives me 46 million. So as I look at the two, I recognize that, wow, it's actually better to just upgrade my existing facility because I have $46 million of expected monetary value versus a 36. Let's go ahead and do that. And so that is how you use a decision tree to figure out your expected monetary value. So on the exam, they're not going to give you this picture. The exam is going to give you scenario A, scenario B. They're going to say you're a project manager for an XYZ company. You and your team are determining whether you should build or upgrade. You note that it cost $120 million to build a new plant and $50 million to upgrade the existing plant. You have a 60% chance of having strong demand, which represents $200 million, and a 40% chance of having weak demand, which represents $90 million if you build a new plant. You have a 60% chance of having strong demand, which represents $120 million, and you have a 40% chance of having weak demand, which represents $60 million if you upgrade the plant. What is the expected monetary, what is the expected monetary value of each, and which one should you choose? And you'll just have to build this out. You have to say, okay, A was 120, B was 50, I have 60, 40% of this demand. I need to subtract out my cost first, then multiply it by the percentage, subtract out my cost first, then multiply it by the percentage, add the two together, get a figure, and then go back to scenario 2, right? Figure out what my investment was. I have my 60-40, subtract out my cost first, multiply it by the percentage, subtract out my cost first, multiply it by the percentage, add the two together, get a figure, pick the larger of the two figures.
Mm-hmm.
Don't overthink this one. Be very, very, very methodical. And again, there is a strategy that says if you get a question like this, bump it, knock it, mark it for review, come back at the end. And if you have time, do it. Why? Because the longest, hardest question is worth 1 point, and the easiest question is worth 1 point. Go get all of your points first, then come back and struggle to get additional points. Does that make sense?
Got it. Yep.
I have yet to have someone ask me for my PMI transcript to see how I scored. And I have yet to have someone ask me to see my college transcripts to see my grades in college. They do want to know that I have that certificate, that bachelor's and that master's, and they do want to know that I have that PMP credential. So I'm just stating that to say that, hey, you want to pass the exam, right? You don't want to answer every question correctly because you will fail if you try to answer every question correctly. Okay, I know that sounds, off, but it's true. It is true. Your approach needs to be correct, just the same way like you're creating approaches with these plans.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So now we're going to plan the risk responses. All right. We're going to come up with strategies to address the threats and strategies to address the opportunities. Okay. Now we have primary strategies, we have backup strategies and contingency plans. All right. And all of this will be documented in the risk register and in our risk report. So contingency plans are fallback plans for risk strategies that don't work. And I'm going to explain all this in a second as we go through. Okay, so our outputs here are simply, we may get a request for change because now we're just coming up with strategies and we may say, okay, you know what? We need to do this activity in a different way so that we can mitigate this risk. And then we may update our approach so that the way we approach managing different knowledge areas will coincide with our risk strategies, right? And then we may update some documents, specifically the risk register and the risk report after this, but we may update others as well based on what we learned. So we want to go and we want to gather all of these data points. We want to use our interpersonal skills to facilitate a meeting so that decisions can be made based on analysis that we've come up with to develop strategies for threats, opportunities, and contingent response strategies that we can then turn into strategies for overall project risk that will end up in the risk report. So the risk register, the risk report, and the project documents must be updated to include details on how we're going to respond, right? What is going to trigger the response? How much money will we put into it? And how long do we have to address the impact? And then we may need to adjust how much money we're putting aside or the thresholds that, maybe to increase or decrease the threshold for when that action will kick in, right? We will update documents and we will add change requests if appropriate. We may need to ask for more money. So planned risk response often require change requests because we're going to have to say, give me more time, or please give me more money, or please modify your scope.
Mm-hmm.
So now the risk registers prioritize lists and their specs. They're used to figure out risk that we want to actually go and define response strategies for, right? We don't need a response strategy for people being late, right? So we only want to look at those risks that we really deem necessary to spend the time to develop some sort of response. So the cost baseline's included in this, right? But it should be specific for the risk. All right, should be. Now let's talk about strategies for threats, and then we'll talk about strategies for opportunities. So let's set this up. Let's set up the example. So let's use a wedding. I recently went to a wedding, so we'll use a wedding, okay? And let's say that we are a project management company, and we specialize in event planning, specifically weddings. That's what we do, okay? Project management company that does wedding planning. So we have a risk register for our wedding, right? Because that's what we do. We do big weddings for the rich and famous, right? So our client wants to have a wedding next Saturday, and the threat of rain looms, okay? The threat of rain looms. Now, that's our situation, right? We're managing, waiting for this client, and we have a threat of rain. All right, so now we can escalate that. Escalate is just going to a higher level when it's outside the scope or it exceeds our priority, so our authority. So we can go back to the customers, the clients, and say, Mr. and Mrs. Client, it's going to rain. What would you like to do? Right? That's all escalating is. Don't overthink that. We can avoid the risk. Now, in order to avoid a risk, you have to change something, right? You can't do the same thing. So it's going to rain this weekend. Either we're going to change, if we want to keep the same date, then we got to go change locales. Or if we want to stay in the same locale, then we got to go indoors. We cannot have an outdoor wedding. I probably didn't specify that. We were going to have an outdoor wedding on a golf course, right? And so if it's going to rain, then we either need to go inside, which is a change of plans to avoid the threat. We either need to change the date to a day that is not raining, right? Change the plans to avoid the threat, or we need to go to a different city where it's not raining. So in order to avoid the threat, you must change some aspect to eliminate the risk, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, we can transfer the risk. We can go to the executive director of the golf course and say, you know what? I looked at the schedule. I noticed that nobody has reserved the clubhouse, and you charge $5,000 to rent the greens. You charge $5,000 to rent the clubhouse. Since nobody has rented the clubhouse, is it possible that we just give you $2,500 as a premium? And if it rains, then we get to come inside and use the clubhouse, and you keep our $2,500. But if it doesn't rain, you still keep our $2,500. That way we don't pay the full $5,000. And, so now we're only out $7,500 instead of $10,000, right? Something like that. So usually the exam will describe something like that, some insurance policy where we then shift the risk to a third party, right? So that's how you transfer risk. You got to shift it to a third party, right? So to avoid a threat, you must change. To transfer a threat, you must introduce a third party. To mitigate a threat, you must take some action. So maybe we say, you know what? It's going to rain. Let's put a tent up. Let's put up a big tent so that we can have an outdoor wedding. People can come in, they can sit underneath the tent and they won't get wet. We have now taken some action to minimize the probability. Well, we can't minimize that. When Mother Nature will cry, she will cry, right? She's going to rain, but we can minimize the impact in a sense. So we put up that tent, okay? That's mitigation. Put up the tent. So, and by mitigation, we mean we don't wait for it to rain. It's Saturday, 10 o'clock, wedding's going to start at 1. We look up, we're like, it's not raining yet, but we think it's going to. Put that tent up now. We are mitigating, right? We don't wait for the risk event to happen. We take action now. Okay. Or we can accept that it's going to rain. Maybe our clients say, no, we actively accept it's going to rain. We know it's going to rain. Don't give the people $2,500 as a premium. If we'll set aside an extra $5,000, we are rich and famous people. Okay. If it rains, we'll just pay for the $5,000. But if it doesn't rain, we don't want them holding on to our $2,500. Okay. Maybe they'll say that. We actively accept. We'll put money aside. If it rains, we have another $5,000 to spend to go inside the clubhouse. Okay. Or they passively accept. They say, yeah, we know it's going to rain, but you know what? So what? Put it on a watch list. Just, make sure it's not a thunderstorm, but if it's a little bit of rain, I'm in love with my wife. She's in love with me as a husband. We want to go get married. And if the people love us, they will stand outside and get wet and watch us, share our love. Who knows? Something like that, right? So that's the active acceptance part. Okay. So, that's the passive acceptance. So passive acceptance, put on the watch list, it's going to rain, all right? Active acceptance, we put aside money. Mitigation, put up that tent now. We're not going to wait. Transfer it, shift it to a third party. Avoid it, change something, date, locale, indoor versus outdoor, or escalate, tell someone. That's it, okay? Now we do the same thing for opportunities. So let's change the example. I'm going to use my neighbor. I'm looking across the street and, they've had some internet issues and they've had to have Comcast come out and dig up the street. Okay. They had the wires inside the house were good. So it turns out that the wire from the box going to their house is no good, so it needs to be replaced. All right, so they had to wait a couple weeks because Comcast had to get permits. You know, it's going to block off the street. You got to go dig it. You got to trench down 18 inches. We're going to call 811 before they dig first. They're going to trench down 18 inches. They're going to go across to the other side of the street, I don't know, 20, 30 feet. You know, take the conduit out, put a new conduit in, put new cable in, patch it back up, connect it to the customer. They're happy. Okay. That's our job. That's what we're supposed to do. Okay. So now we get there and we call 811. Everything's good. We can dig right there. We start digging and we dig. And we're supposed to go 18 inches and we get down 6 inches. Good. We get down 12 inches and we get a little bit of mud coming up. I'm like, man, did we hit a water line? Like, you know, I thought there was nothing here. And we get down 16 inches, a lot of liquids coming up. I'm like, man, this mud. And we get down 18 inches and we realize this isn't mud. This is oil. This is black gold, baby. We're rich. We're rich. Rich. Yeah, that's what we had to feel, right? We got this oil, so we can escalate it. We can call the boss. Hey, boss, guess what? We're here. Yeah, I know you said we got to trench down, but we found oil, and what do you want us to do? Right? That's sort of the escalate, right? Or we can exploit. To exploit means that we must change something. So initially you're supposed to trench down 18 inches and then go some, you know, horizontal spin. Instead, we go down 18, 24, 36, 48 inches. Drill, baby, drill. We are not going across the street. We are going straight down. We are changing everything that we're doing because we're going to make money from this oil. We don't care about you, client, anymore. Your one little monthly fee isn't going to amount to anything to this oil. That's the idea there. We want to exploit this opportunity. Now we can share. Maybe we sit back and we say, wait. We are a telecommunications company. We are not an energy company, more or less a refinery. We got to refine this stuff. So we call our uncle in Texas who owns an oil rigging company. He says, sure, I'll hop out here. Give me 40% of your profits. Consider it done. Okay. Just like to transfer to a third party for a threat, to introduce a third party for an opportunity, you must share. So if you're going to share an opportunity, that means you're going to bring in a third party, you know, to do some aspect that you couldn't do and you all was sharing it. Okay. Now we can enhance, right? We can say, well, a little bit of oil right here, but there might be oil over there. There might be oil over here. Might be oil over there. So we don't tell anybody, and we make these secret plans, and we buy up all the land around these houses, and we buy them up away from everybody. That way we can drill here, there, everywhere, right? We've enhanced our probability of success. So just like when you mitigate, where you must take some action to decrease the probability and or impact, when we enhance, we are going to take some action. I know it says focusing attention, but we're going to take some action, right, to increase the probability and or the impact, right? When we share, we're going to introduce a third party. When we exploit, we must change so that we can ensure we realize this opportunity. And then if we accept, there's both passive acceptance and active acceptance. So actively accepting, we can say, okay, boss can say, all right, thanks for escalating. Continue on with the job for the clients. We're going to spend a couple thousand, and we're going to have somebody come out and do a feasibility study and see if this is, if this is even the right thing to do. Okay. Or we can passively accept. We can say, you know what? This is California. We are a green state. We don't need to burn any fossil fuels. We are going to cover this up, and we just cover up the oil, put a little dirt on top of it. We pat it and walk away and don't say anything. What do you think? You keeping the money, or you saying, nope, this is green state? And you know what's interesting about that? Here in California, as I'm just thinking about this story, we actually have more oil rigs in the state of California than there are in the state of Texas. Did you know that?
No, I did not.
We produce a lot of oil in this state. Yeah, it's like you wouldn't think it, but drive down I-5 and you'll see them all. You'll see them all. We have way more oil rigs in this state than in Texas, and Texas is known for its oil drilling. So it's just kind of funny how like we're this green state, but yet we drill and produce more oil than. Okay. So those are the strategies for opportunity, strategies for threats. Remember, to exploit an opportunity or to avoid a threat, you must change something. To transfer a threat or to share in an opportunity, you must introduce a third party. To mitigate a threat or to enhance an opportunity, you must take some action to increase, you must take some action to change the probability and or impact, whether positive or negative. And then the passively accept or actively accept is same for both. You put aside money or you put it on a watch list. And then we can escalate both. Those are the same. Okay. All right. And then strategies for overall project risk. Excuse me. We have escalate, exploit. Yep. Then you can avoid the risk. You can exploit the opportunity. You can transfer, share. You can mitigate or enhance, or you can accept, right? It's just, these are for specific risk, an individual threat, an individual opportunity, or for the entire project, you can either avoid or exploit, transfer or share, mitigate or enhance, or accept. Okay. Now, we're missing one. Let me come back here. The way my slides are, the way I'm teaching it today, I want to come back and talk about where is it? Okay. Right here, contingency plans and fallback plans. Okay. So now, if we go back to the example of the wedding, you have a contingency plan and a fallback plan. The if then, that's what these are, right? I know it says contingency plans are fallback plans. They are. So a contingency plan is a type of fallback plan. And then there's just a fallback plan. So let me explain the two because, PMI may try to trip you up. And this is also, for the practical application of project management. All right. So we talked about if we're in a wedding and the threat of rain looms. And so we can either avoid it by changing it, transferring it or mitigate it, right? So in a fallback plan and a contingency plan, let's talk about the contingency plan since it's a type of fallback plan. The contingency plan is the if then. So if we put the tent out before it rains, we're just mitigating, okay? But if, say, we hire the tent company and we say, all right, guys, you can attend our rich and famous wedding. You need to wear something nice. Have your van parked very close, and the moment it starts raining, haul butt, go get that tent, pop it up. That's a contingency plan, okay? If it rains, then we will put the tent up. If we put the tent up prior to the rain happening, we're mitigating. Does that make sense? If we wait for the risk event to happen, now the contingency plan falls in. It's like, if it rains, then put up the tent, okay? That's the contingency plan. The fallback plan says that we are changing our course, okay? If it rains, then we go inside. If it rains, then we cancel and we have a new date. If it rains, then we go to a new venue, okay? The fallback plan says that you are changing your action or your activity. Fallback plan is original plan didn't work. We're falling back to a new plan, all right? So if I fall back to another plan, then that's, we've changed the plan. But if I come up with a contingency so that I can continue on with the existing plan, then it's just a contingency response. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Plans don't change. It's just that part of it's changing, and it's a contingency response.
Correct.
Okay.
All right, here we go. Get some water.
Okay.
What are the 2 data analysis methods that are used to evaluate and select a preferred risk response strategy?
C.
Okay. Which of the following is not a desired characteristic of a proper risk response plan?
Hmm.
Question theory says that the way it's written, one of these does not match the other 3.
A.
Okay. And then what are the 5 alternative strategies that must be considered when dealing with threats?
A.
Okay. Okay, good. You did not so good, but that's okay, because here's the point. The first question is designed to get you to pick C, quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis, but those are processes, and it didn't ask you what are the 2 processes. It asked you what are the 2 data analysis methods. So this is a classic example that you just had of what's the term I'm looking for? It's sort of like when I tell people you need to take between 5 and 6 practice exams, it's because it takes you that long to identify how the questions are written, right? It takes about just 4 or 5 times. It's like, on average, just anything that you practice, right? So once you do that about 4, 5, 6 times, you're like, oh yeah, okay, what are the 2 data analysis methods? Okay, you did not ask me about a process, so it can't be C. Okay, and then you can throw that out. And then you can say, I've never heard of risk optimization analysis. You can throw that out. And then you would say, risk analysis and contingency reserve analysis. Do I do contingency reserve analysis when I'm coming up with the risk responses? And you'd be like, no, I would have did that when I was either estimating time, money, or resources. So then you would throw that out and you would default to A.
Okay. That makes sense.
For
That's
the
tricky.
second, yeah, that is a tricky one. That's probably a level 7 of 10 on the exam, like in terms of difficulty. See, the questions that people think that the questions that are really long, like 8, 9 lines of text, are the hard ones. They're not. If I have to write 8, 9 lines of text, it's because I'm trying to confuse you because the question is too easy. So if I could just ask you a simple question with 4 choices, I know it's a good question, right? So technically speaking, this first question is more difficult than a question that would give you, 8, 9 lines of text and try to confuse you because you just either know it or you don't. Now, question theory for the second one says that when I said one of these words don't fit, sometimes you can simply pick an answer by saying this. Okay, what's a desired characteristic? Is it appropriate? Is it cost effective? Is it time? Is it realistic? And you're like, time doesn't make sense. Is it appropriate? Is it cost effective? Is it timely? Or is it realistic? Oh, timely. There's no timely. It's time. Time is not the same as appropriate or cost effective or realistic, just in the way that it's written. So therefore, that one is different. I'm going to pick that one. That's a strategy that you can use when you don't know the answer. And almost any multiple choice exam that will work. Does that make sense right there?
Yeah, that does make sense. It's not like a description. It's not describing it.
Right. So therefore, it couldn't be a characteristic, right? It
It's a
needs to be like
noun. Yeah.
And then you got the 5 alternative strategies. So that's good. So, okay. Same thing as yesterday. We ended at 12:09. Was about to be 12:10 in 2 seconds. So it's now 12:10. So just a 20-minute break and come right back at 12:30? Or do you want a full half hour?
I need to pick up my charger nearby. So it might be like 10 minutes over. So I think I might need the whole half hour.
Take the half hour. Call me. You have my number. Call me. Text me when you're ready to come back, and I'll come back in.
Okay. Awesome.
If you're gonna, if it's after, or I should say if it's earlier, and then I'll just jump in.
Okay. Okay, awesome. Thanks, CJ. See you
You're
soon. Bye.